It hired a homegrown superintendent and gave her a blank check to implement a plan that would raise student achievement. The district had a $10 million budget surplus to fund the reform, as well as promises of further support from the Gates Foundation. It is rare for the stars favoring reform in an urban district to be so nicely aligned. Yet even with this combination of luck and leadership, the district faced both predictable and unexpected obstacles in dismantling one comprehensive high school, revising nearly all of its standard operating procedures for busing, food services, and budgeting, and bringing in national school models into the district, all within 3 years. The superintendent and her executive team constantly faced situations in which they had to make trade-offs between competing values. They struggled to preserve the ideals of reform and to maintain enthusiasm among teachers, students, staff, and community members. And they also had to respond to disappointments and setbacks, especially the defeat of bond referendum and continued scoring low on the state test. No amount of money or hope can spare districts the challenges associated with fundamental reform. Business-inspired policymakers and foundation leaders talk about the return on investment, incubating innovations, only to discover that making substantial changes in schools is more complicated and political than running Microsoft or Intel. Mayors take over school districts from elected school boards only to find themselves constrained by many stakeholders, laws, and policies more difficult to negotiate than they had imagined. Dynamic, tough-talking superintendents quickly institute dramatic reforms, then exit just as quickly because they lose political capital or lack the endurance to tackle day-to-day issues arising from the change. Private foundations set out believing that millions of dollars in elite teams of consultants can overcome the deeply rooted problems that plague urban schools, only to discover that their interventions have yielded little to no improvement in student outcomes. What makes school reform so tough, even in a small district of 5,000 students? The short answer is that designing and implementing reforms in public schools, while securing the resources to fund and sustain those reforms, is a political process open to many stakeholders who have strong value differences about what ought to happen in schools and classrooms. These differences in values produce the tensions and dilemmas that accompany reforms, including those aimed at creating small high schools. Unfortunately, reformers and other stakeholders often interpret these conflicts, these dilemmas, as evidence of resistance and failure rather than the inevitable outcome of major systemic change. As a result, the energy and funding required to sustain reforms begin to wane. Yet these dilemmas cannot be prevented. Instead, they must be anticipated and carefully managed. Any public school district that seeks, as Mapleton did, to reinvent the schools will confront dilemmas such as these. Consider this dilemma, a common one. How much autonomy can individual small high schools have while still sticking to the district standards and rules? For example, can each small high school establish its own time schedule and yearly calendar, or does each school have to adhere to the district schedule and calendar? Can a small school that relies on project-based learning through computers continue when its students annually fail the state test? Or consider this dilemma. Can a district establish small high schools and still provide efficient district-wide services in sports, busing, and lunches without creating confusion among teachers, students, and parents? The logistical challenges involved in giving every parent a choice of which small high school to send their child means facing serious issues of maintaining student and parent loyalty to high school football and other sports. With different small high schools scattered across the district, Even the most experienced school officials flinch when considering the work necessary to provide busing to students in a reconfigured school district or providing fresh and cooked food for breakfasts and lunches in different locations. You get the picture of how hard it is to manage this dilemma. And then there's the dilemma about what about the pressure by state officials for improved student achievement and hasty district implementation of changes to find out whether those reforms are working and producing those test scores. Get it done, get those scores up quickly. With a strong commitment to accountability and testing, state policymakers have continually pressed Mapleton officials for increases in student scores to avoid slipping into academic probation or closing their schools. Yet establishing clusters of small high schools where parents choose which schools to send their sons and daughters requires careful planning and time to put the right people and practices in place. Those people and practices cannot turn on a dime simultaneously and simultaneously produce higher test scores. Often when reforms aimed at classroom practices such as project-based teaching are introduced, there is an implementation dip. That is, a few years when student test scores actually slip before they recover and rise. Few state policymakers are known for their patience. Thus, another dilemma has to be managed. These and other dilemmas lie in wait for reform-minded leaders eager to move ahead with small high schools. So how has Mapleton managed these dilemmas? The issue of autonomy and compliance with district standards has been negotiated and renegotiated time and again between Mapleton small school principals and the district superintendents over school calendars, professional development, busing, food service budgeting, and of great importance, whether or not to prepare students for the state test. Where it stands today is that Mapleton small high school principals now come mostly from within the district rather than outside, which means that the issue of school freedom to act independently is much lower on these principals' agendas. District requests and standards are largely adhered to. What about academic achievement? For the first 3 years of small high schools, Mapleton test scores came in as one of the lowest in the state. State officials threatened putting Mapleton on academic probation. 2 low-performing and under-enrolled schools were closed, including that new technology high school. Then, beginning in 2009 and now for 2010, test scores have shown growth in reading and math. Still, less than half of the students are proficient in reading and 1/3 are proficient in math. Much more improvement has to occur. That is the Mapleton story thus far. Implementing major reforms in an urban school system, big or small, is intense and unforgiving work, not only for the school boards and district superintendents, but also for principals, teachers, service personnel, and students themselves. As obstacles proliferate, too many districts lose heart and return to the status quo. In Mapleton, on the other hand, a small district developed a reform plan and has stuck to it for a decade. A decade. Its story offers lessons to other similar districts and even to larger ones about how to achieve full implementation while remaining open to constant adaptation and change. I believe that other districts can benefit from seeing how Mapleton reconfigured its policies in order to make small schools a reality. And I hope the Mapleton story will help other districts anticipate the dilemmas associated with small high school reform and manage them successfully. Let me sum up now. Smaller, more personalized environments make a lot of sense, especially because many teenagers' lack of motivation stand in the way of learning, going to college, and getting a job. Combining small, rigorously demanding schools with expanded parental choice joins 2 reforms and thus far has proved viable for Mapleton. But the track record of small schools and the challenges to their creation on a large scale, as in Cleveland, argue for pursuing multiple pathways and goals, both for students who drop out and those who graduate.